This tutorial is on what is perhaps an unfortunately named piece in modern times, so I'll just call it Debussy's Cakewalk in case YouTube's automatic screening gets upset. It's a fabulous lively little piece which is part of his Children's Corner. So if you're sitting comfortably, then let's begin. This short piece can be split into 4 main sections as I've shown here. We effectively have an ABA type form where we have a middle part sandwiched between very similar material, hence using A twice. However, I found it worth splitting the A section, so to speak, into 2 smaller ones for practice purposes, as it's easier to manage our practice time in that way. As always, I like to divide and conquer, so looking at that first section, we can subdivide it into 6 segments. The opening bars are straightforward enough. However, given both hands need to confidently move down the keyboard, we might want to ensure we don't need to be looking at the score whilst playing them. So before even starting to practice them, let's just take a couple of minutes to see what's there. An extremely good analysis technique is pattern recognition, whereby if we're able to see something as a pattern, then effectively we can combine multiple measures, in this case into 1 or 2 things that become easier to remember. So the first measure is based on a B-flat 7 chord. If we look at measures 2, 3 and 4, we can see that effectively these are the same notes in both hands, which just move down an octave each time. These are basically an A-flat minus 6 chord. We then have a B-flat 6 as our very last chord. So this gives us enough anchor points so that as we glance at the score, we can see B-flat, 3 A-flats and then a B-flat at the end. All we then need to mentally add is the rhythm, and we pretty much have these 4 measures memorized, or at least well enough so that as we look at the score, we're able to take in all 4 measures in one glance. Now let's move on to the remainder of the section, where the biggest challenge is a left hand that needs to be staccato, mostly light and leaping around constantly. Playing individual jumps isn't perhaps that challenging, but playing more than 60s we have in this one section in very fast succession is a whole different ballgame. And my view is that there is little point practicing something like this slowly. This is an idea I got from William Weston's book, The Perfect Wrong Note, where he points out that in some music we need to think of practicing in terms of target practice. Jumps are all about getting from one place to another quickly and reliably. Thus, practicing them slowly doesn't help us to achieve this. However, at the same time, simply playing through a section, even as small as this, with mistakes all over the place, is unlikely to get us very far. So to practice a passage like this, I like to use a technique I call cycling, which requires us to break things down even further. Indeed, in a case like this, I'd go as far as to say we should start by practicing individual jumps. As we analyse this little segment, we can see 4 distinctly different jumps, which basically repeat themselves in various combinations over 4 measures. Note that I'm including differences in the right hand here, even though for the left hand we could argue that there are only really 2 different combinations, one up and one down. But this is because the left hand needs to jump whilst the right hand is playing, and thus we need to practice these combinations too. Our starting point then is to work on these individual jumps initially, and this is the material we will use to cycle. First, before actually touching the keyboard, let's take a little look at what we have. As we can see, we have an interesting challenge. Whilst the right hand is almost simplicity itself, it just keeps repeating the same notes, we have a left hand needing to jump to play some notes between those being played in the right. So we'll need to keep our right hand close to the fallboard and in an unusually raised position to make plenty of space for the left hand underneath. Now let's just take the first jump. First, we look closely at the left hand notes and put them into our short-term memory, as we don't want to need to be looking up at the score whilst we practice. We then practice the jump. A key aspect of William Weston's approach is that mistakes here are to be embraced. Initially, we might find we miss it more times than we hit it, And we shouldn't worry about that. We work out why we missed. Did our right hand get in the way of the left? Did the left hand under or overshoot? So ensure you always include this little thinking time between each repeat of the jump. Get into the habit straight away of thinking about how it feels. Our hand should be perfectly relaxed and not locked into position. Think of an arch movement as you go from one position to another, and then activate your fingers at the very last instant to play the notes. Spend a minute or so on this jump alone. Do you find that you're starting to hit it more than you miss it? Then move on to the next jump. Here we'll start with the top notes of the left hand and practice the jump down. Again, commit the notes to memory and spend a minute or so on that one. The same process for the third and the fourth. Now, however, we're not going to move on to the next bit. Instead, we're going to cycle back through what we've just done, jump by jump. Don't be afraid to relook at the score and double check you're definitely practicing the right notes. Ideally, try to cycle through all of this 3 times in a single practice session. What you will find is that soon you're able to repeat a given jump 3 times in a row, then 5, then 7, and so forth. So as you cycle through each day, your target will change from practice for a minute to practice until we get 3 consecutive successes, for example. For any particular jump, that process might be quite quick, or it could be much slower. Once we feel that each individual jump is secure, and maybe not 100%, but certainly misses should now be the exception and not the rule, let's move on to 2 jumps. As you can see in this case, we now have 3 different possibilities we need to practice. We now use the same cycling approach, practicing each pair of jumps for a minute or so, and then moving on to the next. And again, we cycle through them all a total of 3 times. Depending on how easy you find these jumps to do, you might work in this way for a few days until you feel you can confidently land them each time. Our next stage is then to practice 3 jumps together. Again, ensuring we cycle through them 3 times each practice session. Once we're happy that 3 jumps are now secure, we can move on. Due to the way that this piece is written, this effectively means we can practice in terms of entire measures. Again, work on each measure for 1 or 2 minutes until you can land them 3 times in a row and cycle through them 3 times. Don't forget, light and relaxed, yet perfectly controlled. Our next step is then to practice each measure and add the first, 8th, or maybe even quarter note of the next. Again, we cycle through them in exactly the same way we have been doing so far. Once we're super comfortable with this, we can start cycling through 2 measures at a time, then 3 at a time, and before we know it, we've got the entire segment nicely in our fingers. Now, my advice is when we come back to practicing this on any given day, we should start from the step before where we finished yesterday. So let's say yesterday we were working on 3 jumps, then let's start today with just 2 to test out whether we can still do it easily. If we find that our first 3 attempts are all successful, then we can move straight back to 3 jumps again. If, however, we find we're struggling, then let's just keep working on 2 jumps and cycle through these again. Let's not forget that even in just these few measures, the left hand needs to jump 16 times, and the remainder of this section has exactly the same design, so we've got a lot of jumping around to contend with. However, cycling doesn't need to end here. Now, rather than cycling through these tiny bits, we can cycle through both segments 1 and 2, each 3 times perhaps. However, when practicing the first segment, let's add on just 1 measure of the second so we get very used to the join. Depending on how long you have to practice this each day, you might find initially that working on just these particular segments is enough. However, what you will find is that the amount of time it takes to practice them reduces considerably because we have less breaks between each repetition, so we can think, we make fewer mistakes, even to the point that with a target of, say, getting 7 repetitions without a single error, it takes next to no time to do. And as this happens, we can move on to the next segment. So with that said, let's look at the next segment. The left hand here is very similar, but the right hand now has a melody plus some accompaniment notes to play. To make it slightly more challenging, we have notes on the offbeat 2 here. Our cycling approach works fantastically well here too though. We start with individual jumps, which this time due to the combinations of left and right hand notes are all different, so we have more of them. Here we have 24 jumps in all, and so initially we might need to limit how much of it we work on at a time. The key thing is that we always allow ourselves time to cycle 3 times through whatever we're working on. We can then move on to pairs of jumps as we did before. You can see here, again, I overlap them. You might prefer not to. Then we can move on to entire measures. Afterwards, 1 measure and a beat. I'm sure you get the idea by now that we'll then move to 2 measures together, then 3, until we have the entire segment done. Our next segment has jumps only in the first 2 measures. In addition, we have already worked on this same jump from the left hand's perspective earlier. We now just have a different right hand. With this in mind, you might opt to start with 2 jumps at a time rather than just 1. The final 2 measures, as we can see, have the same notes in both hands. Here we can still use our cycling approach as we go to practicing measures plus then a measure and a beat, plus 2 measures and so forth. I won't break this down here as I'm sure you get the cycling idea now and you can easily implement it for yourself. Don't forget now that once we have completed this segment, we can also add it to our daily cycling routine where we will cycle segment 1 plus a measure of segment 2 plus 1 measure of segment 3, and then segment 3. Our next segment is in fact the same as the third, and so in a way this is free. However, we do need to notice that now we need to be playing much more loudly. On that basis, I'd be inclined to start by cycling through this using a measure and a beat maybe, adding focus to the dynamics, since we're now using very familiar notes. For our last segment here, I actually found myself practicing it in 2 halves and using add-on. That's to say, I would first work on just 1 beat. Once this feels secure, I would add the 2nd beat, then the 3rd, and then the 4th. We can use the same approach with the 2nd half, however, we still cycle through both halves as we put them together. For a little more pattern recognition, we can note that the top note of the chords in the first 2 measures goes up chromatically. I found that in the second 2 measures, a key consideration was hand position due to using the thumb on a black key here. Again, once we have this segment under our fingers, we can go back to cycling through the entire section segment by segment each day. Once we feel we can reliably repeat each of these 3 times in a row and cycle through them 3 times, then we can start adding these by cycling through 2 segments until we are practicing this entire segment without stopping. Now let's look at our next section. As I said earlier, whilst this is really still part of the A section, the reason I chose to separate it out was because I actually found it extremely tricky. Again, for practice purposes, I've split it down into 3 segments. If we look at the first, we can see we now have the left hand jumping over the right, which with my smaller hands isn't easy ergonomically. Equally, with both pinky and thumb playing on black notes, hand position is important, as there is very little room for error. We also have a big jump upwards with the right hand, as well of course as coming back down again. We again here have the left hand jumping over the right, yet here the intervals mean that I'm needing to land the left hand finger on the thin portion of the white keys between the black notes as I jump. Thus the problem solving aspect of this took me much longer than it did for the first section, and I wanted to have at least a reasonable proportion of the piece under the fingers as quickly as I could. So when I was working on these, I found it took much longer to both land the jumps, but also incorporate the right hand as well. I found I needed to keep the right hand low to make space for the left. The left hand equally needs to release the notes, as sometimes the right needs to play the same one immediately after. Equally, the fingering I settled on means that my left thumb keeps playing black notes. Finally, in the 3rd measure, I found that in addition to a rotating motion when jumping, I needed to jump both towards and away from the fall board towards it to get my thumb happily on the black note, and away from it to get my pinky happily on the thick portion of the white note. All of that said, we can use the exact same approach of individual jumps, then pairs, then measures, etc. when practicing each of these segments. However, here I found that I also needed to gradually add each half beat of the third and fourth measures to the first and second, even though I practiced each measure as a single unit. The last four measures, we can use the entire measures to cycle easily enough. As we can see, the next segment starts off in exactly the same way as the previous one. Thus, we only have the three measures at the end which introduce new material. Even then, the third measure picks up the same idea as the final measure of the introduction, which is a nice pattern that helps. I find this last segment almost like a little holiday, time to relax before the next section. Indeed, I didn't even bother jumping here. I simply take the higher left-hand notes with my right hand, a solution that I found doesn't work well at the beginning. Let's use the cycling approach we used earlier as we got each segment under control. First, segment 1 plus a beat of segment 2 plus a beat of segment 3, etc, etc. Now we've come to our middle section. Here the character of the piece changes entirely. Let's take a second to look at what we have. First, it's in the somewhat less familiar key of G flat. Personally, I find it often takes me a little longer to learn pieces in a key signature with 6 flats. Therefore, it can be very helpful to try to pick out the patterns in it. Next, it's intended to be a little slower, un peu moins vite. It's also intended to be played with quite a lot of rubato. We have the marking CD, which means to give way, slow down, and then of course a tempo, which is back up to speed. You'll also notice avec une grande émotion, so with lots of emotion. So clearly Debussy really doesn't want this to sound like the earlier section. Whilst we don't have constant jumps to contend with here in the same way as we did with the first, there are still a few rapid position shifts that we need to master. You might notice that these segments are longer than those we used earlier. This is simply because I found the material here less challenging, and thus longer segments work well enough. In our first segment, note the way the left hand often needs to hold a long note, so for me with 2 or 1, whilst playing staccato notes underneath it. Note also the right hand has lots of grace notes. I play these with the grace note and the rest of the chord on the beat, and then go to the main bottom note afterwards. You'll also notice a G flat major scale in the left hand too, something which is a common feature of this middle section. I would still use our cycling approach here, however now I would use chunks of 2 measures at a time. Our next segment comes a little more slowly. We can notice the opening bars have a fragment of the G flat scale in the left hand, followed by a short chromatic passage. The harmony appears to be going through F major, C7, and then to A flat minor 6. It's worth noting these details to help our reading. There's also a jump when we arrive in A flat minor 6, and this time it's both hands that need to do the jump. So initially, I worked on the portion up to and including the jump at the a tempo, and then I worked separately on the staccato chords with their grace notes. We can work on the next 4 measures in a similar way. Our final 4 measures here have a very interesting feature. Something I've noticed with Debussy is that he will hide basic scales in plain sight, such that we don't even realise it's basically just a scale. If we look from the 3rd measure of this snippet, we have a G flat major scale descending underneath the melody in the right hand. However, and this is where it's clever to me, the left hand first plays the same scale a 3rd below, and then switches to a 6th below. Again, I find it worth noticing these things as it really helps me to play it better, as it's no longer just a jumble of notes in an unfamiliar key signature. It's a simple scale for the most part with a few added melody notes. So I would start practicing this strands separately, by playing just the scale portions in both hands. Ideally, try to use the fingering you'll use in the end result, but don't worry too much as you're not really creating muscle memory here, we're creating analytical memory. Once we're good with these strands, let's add back the missing notes and do this one hand at a time if necessary. Our next segment has a very similar design. This time, however, the chords in the left hand have a descending top note each time. In the final two measures, you'll notice Debussy does the scale thing again. First starting the scale in the right hand and then letting the left hand take over. All of this over a C-flat 6 chord in the left hand. So I'd again practice this in similar snippets as we did to the previous one. We can also ensure we get that jump secure and practice just the bass and scale part of the final couple of measures. Our final segment of this middle section gives us an opportunity to use the Sostenuto pedal. You'll notice that twice we have a chord and bass note held down with some staccato notes above them, which the hand can't reach on its own. To me, this means that these phrases should be definitely played with pedal. However, we do have the option to use a Sostenuto pedal if we wish. If you're unfamiliar with this pedal, then basically we keep holding down the chord in the right hand whilst we play the bass notes. Then as soon as we play the final D flat, we depress the Sostenuto pedal, and this means that we can now release the chord in our right hand and it will continue to be sustained whilst we play the staccato notes above. Our final section is in fact almost free once we've mastered the rest. There are just a couple of spots where Debussy mixes up the harmony and of course a lovely little flourish at the end. I would learn these differences and then get into the habit of practicing them in similar segments as those we use for the second section. By now, we should be at the point we can comfortably play each section, and so it's just a case of adding them together. I prefer to do this gradually. I'll often start with a section plus one or two segments of the next one. I do this as whilst even if we can play each one independently, there's still a degree of mental stamina we need to build up, especially in a piece like this where there is very little opportunity to take our eye off the ball, as it were. However, before you do start practicing, I highly recommend you listen to a good few versions of this. I find that Seongjin Cho plays it beautifully, but there are plenty of other interpretations to get ideas from. Note that different pianists have very different ideas of tempo too, so I think it's perfectly fine to aim for the lower end initially without feeling the need to go at breakneck speed. Good luck with learning this fabulous little gem, and if you'd also like to try another piece of Debussy, then I've linked a tutorial to his Filles aux cheveux de lin here for you. If you're not already, please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner, click that little notification bell so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.